Welcome to 8vbebop, where we talk about all things jazz, bass trombone, and jazz bass trombone, co-hosted by myself and Chris Glassman. This week we have Jeff Nelson as a guest.
Jeff Nelson graduated from the Fredonia School of Music, University of New York in 1985. He has since been one of New York's leading jazz bass trombonists. Mr. Nelson has toured and performed with many renowned artists, including Lionel Hampton, Dizzy Gillespie, Maria Schneider, Harry Connick Jr., Slide Hampton, Louis Bellson, Toshiko Akiyoshi, Dave Holland, Stephon Harris, Ray Hargrove, and Paquito de Rivera, as well as the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra, Mingus Big Band, the Manhattan Jazz Orchestra, and the Carnegie Hall Jazz Band. It's quite a resume. He's in demand across various musical genres and has shared the stage with performers including Tony Bennett, Luciano Pavarotti, Diana Ross, Michael McDonald, Aretha Franklin, Jerry Mulligan, Ron Carter, Nicholas Payton, Burt Bacharach, David Sanborn, Neo, Frankie Valli, Shaka Khan, Korn, Lou Rawls, Cheap Trick, Bono, the Manhattan Transfer, the Met Opera Brass, and the Late Show CBS Orchestra. He has performed with classical orchestras, including the American Symphony Orchestra, American Ballet Theater, Manhattan Chamber Orchestra, and Opera Saratoga. And he's held chairs in 15 different Broadway show orchestras, including Sunset Boulevard, Titanic, Fosse, Thoroughly Modern Millie, Frozen, and revivals of West Side Story, Les Miserables, and Miss Saigon.
He's also a regular orchestra member for the annual TV broadcast of Broadway's Tony Awards, and is recorded with Dave Liebman, Sting, Jimmy Heath, Michel Legrand, Terrence Blanchard, Kenny Werner, Michael Formanek, Vanessa Williams, Linda Eder, James Carter, Brett Eldridge, Harry Connick Jr., and is also part of the Daphnis Prieto's recent album, Back to the Sunset, which won the 2019 Grammy Awards for Best Latin Jazz Album. He's also been heard on movie soundtracks for Clockers, Across the Universe, The Greatest Showman, Ocean's 8, Gemini Man, Noel, Mel Brooks's musical remake of The Producers, and the Coen Brothers' True Grit and Hail Caesar, among others. And he's played on multiple sports themes for the NFL, NBA, USTA, and PGA, as well as for numerous TV and radio themes and jingles. A CD with his own group, the New York Trombone Conspiracy, entitled A Matter of Time, was released several years ago to critical acclaim and is available for purchase on iTunes. You could buy it directly off of him as well. That's the first track that we were listening to, is his original piece, Final Stages, from that record. It's a beautiful record. We'll recommend. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah.
Of course. What have you been up to this quarantine?
I kind of put away the horn for maybe a week and a half or so and got involved in tearing the apartment here apart and doing various projects and so forth. But in looking at a lot of what I was kind of inspired by, a lot of what people have put up online, some great things that people have been doing just, when they're at home, either by themselves or in collaboration with other people. So that's really inspired me to try to get back and get some personal projects going. I've been getting into video editing. A good friend of mine has been on doing that. And so I'm learning a lot about that and hoping to put that to some creative use and tweaking my in-home recording capabilities here. So hopefully I can get some stuff happening. And I have to say, the two of you, I should include you in that as well, that you've been really, it's a great series. You've really been making lemonade out of lemons, and it's a great thing. So all this has really been inspirational to try to, get some things going at home.
So I imagine with all the virtual recording, you've been doubling so much to do that. Can you talk a little bit about doubling?
The different instruments, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I've always been into doing that. I came from a very musical family. Both my parents were music teachers, and so we had all kinds of instruments around at home, and I was always interested in playing all kinds of things, But as far as the trombone player goes, it kind of expanded to that once I started playing trombone. I played tenor and bass trombone pretty much through high school and got into college and started playing tuba a little bit and euphonium and, all kinds of different things. And so it's always been appealing to me to try to do that, as well as to play in all kinds of different musical styles. So even though I always consider myself a bass trombone player first and foremost, so I've always played a lot of tenor trombone, a lot of tuba. I just did a recording the other day it's going to be used, a big Broadway thing this Sunday. I don't know if I'm supposed to say anything more about it or not, but anyway, so play tuba on that. And I've been playing a lot of tuba at the show that I'm doing now. And so it's always been appealing to me. I feel like I had a good bass playing bass trombone. I could go, larger and play contrabass or tuba. I could go a little smaller and playing tenor trombone or and so forth. So as long as I'm all kind of practicing them enough, I think, and I got horns. One thing I should say is I felt at one point, at least playing tenor and bass trombone, that it was a lot easier for me if I got horns that were very similar, the same make or something. I used to play. I have a Bach bass trombone that's my primary bass trombone, and so I have some other Bach tenor trombones because it was easier for me to switch to those if I hadn't been playing them a lot, as opposed to I used to play a Conn 8H, which is a great horn, but it was very different, I felt, than my Bach bass trombone. So it was a harder switch if I hadn't been playing a lot of it. So anyway, there's just some thoughts on that for what they're worth.
That's great advice. How did you get into playing contra bass trombone? Because I know for jazz bass trombonists, at least, or people who consider themselves jazz bass trombonists, the contra is kind of a step that gets skipped. You go straight to tuba.
Well, it's there's probably more opportunities to play tuba than there are, contrabass is sort of a specialty thing. You see it and you hear it in opera and some other orchestral situations, maybe trombone choirs once in a while. And it's a cool instrument. I wanted to get one just to play it and fool around with it. And then when you get one, you have to find opportunities to play it.
Yeah.
Unless you have a dedicated reason to go out and, get one if you're playing Wagner or something like that. So I got one and I'd think about playing it and introduced it to some couple different recording projects that I was doing with people and thought, this kind of thing would work well on a contrabass. And I talked to the band leader, and a couple of times that I did it somewhat recently, they're like, sure, give it, let's give it a shot, and I tried it and they was like, yeah, that sounds great. Let's use that, so it's that kind of thing. It's fun to play. It's in a different key. Mine is in F as which is pretty common for contrabass, but it's very different than a bass trombone. It's a lot bigger and it feels different, but it's fun to play. So
you mentioned something earlier that I thought was kind of interesting, and that's that you actually, when you're playing tenor, you double on a 36, right? You play a 36 for your smallest horn.
Well, I have a couple. I mean, I have a 42, which is a larger bore tenor, and then a 36, which is a little smaller than that. I don't generally play anything that's smaller than that. That kind of works for applications where a smaller tenor trombone, where a 42 or something like that is probably a little bigger. Yeah. And a little darker than what probably makes more sense. So the 36 for me generally works pretty well. If I try to play anything smaller than that, because again, I'm used to playing bass trombone most of the time. So my tendency is to put way too much air through the horn, and a smaller horn just doesn't want to deal with that, so yeah, it's an issue, I think, with doubling. If you're a bass trombone player, you're probably used to, as I do, that's what I do the majority of the time. So I'm used to putting a certain amount of air through the horn to play certain things, and you go to a smaller horn and you have to adjust in your head that you don't have to put that much air through the horn. You shouldn't put that much air through the horn, so it's part of the challenge of doubling, which I enjoy the challenge, and so it's something that goes along with that.
Can you talk a little bit about your transition from classical music to more commercial and jazz oriented music?
Sure. I don't necessarily consider it a transition so much, although academically my studies have always been more in the quote unquote classical genre. I never really studied jazz. I never really had the opportunity to do that, but I always played it since about 8th grade or so, when I joined the high school jazz band and got into playing that and played in throughout high school with some friends of mine in various size smaller groups, and got into listening to a lot of jazz. I felt like I developed a good sense of playing in that style, which is important. And then when I went to college at Fredonia, they didn't have an academic jazz program. They had a very strong student-run jazz program, which I was a part of, and then got involved with some friends and put together a small jazz group that we did a lot of stuff there. So but I was always playing both classical and jazz and all kinds of different styles of music, even in high school, doing church music and playing for local theater groups and local regional youth orchestra in Albany and upstate New York, and jazz groups. And there was a community college jazz group that I played in high school and so forth. So I was always felt like I was doing a lot of different styles of music, which is something that I still enjoy doing. So even though I was studying technically as a classical player, I was always playing jazz, throughout my whole high school and college career. So
Really quickly, we've got someone on Facebook just asked, can you talk just a little bit about the Game of Thrones recording that you're a part of?
That was a blast. Andy Bove, who was a great tuba player in New York here and a recording engineer as well. I got a text from him or something one day, and he said, "Hey, do you have a contrabass trombone?" And I said, "Yeah, I got one. Sure, let's go." So he had this idea. He said, "Well, I'm putting this thing together. I have an idea of something that would be fun to do. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Sure, I'd love to do it." So we got a bunch of people together one day I think it was out in a college in New Jersey, and he had set up a whole audio and video recording, and he said, let's do this and we'll put it out and see what happens, and it was a lot of fun to do, and it's taken off. It's gotten a life of its own. And then, geez, I don't remember how many years ago that was initially, but then last year, maybe about roughly a year ago, maybe not that long ago, he decided to do another one, 2 pieces with an even larger group. So, we'll see if it actually ever develops into, doing some more stuff. It'd be fun to do. It's been a blast and people seem to really like it. So
you play a lot in jazz bands, in your trombone ensemble. We've talked about classical music a little bit, and now we're talking about being in the studio. Can you talk about what skills are unique to these genres and then which ones kind of transfer over?
Well, I think there's universal things that apply to any kind of music that you're playing, and they may differ a little bit. Issues like time and intonation. I mean, intonation is self-explanatory. That's something that is important in any kind of style of music, pretty much, and sound and so forth. There are different techniques and different things that they may apply differently when you're playing in a jazz group, something like the Vanguard band or something, where there's often a laid-back time feel. You guys had Dave Taylor on. I noticed, I was checking out a little his thing, and he was talking about fluidity of time in that band and feeling time as a group and not so much as a steady concept, which was interesting. And then you play in a chamber orchestra, and that can be very much the same way. If you play in a funk band or something, time has a completely different feel there than it would. So there's different ways to approach different things. For me, I do a lot of jazz playing, a lot of large jazz ensemble playing, and so that kind of playing is very second nature to me. So, and then if I go play in a large orchestra somewhere, that's a different kind of playing, and I have to, in my head, just set myself to play that kind of music, and that's a different kind of thing. It becomes very apparent as soon as you start playing that this is a very different kind of playing, and I have to adjust what I do in that kind of situation. And the same as playing in a horn section of a pop group or something. That's a different kind of playing too, and I have to. And it's all about listening and trusting what you're hearing, and trusting what the other people around you are doing, trusting your own ability to fit into that, adjust as you go, I guess.
Do you think your sound concept changes, or the concept of tone and color changes between groups?
Somewhat. I mean, I have the Bach bass trombone, this one here, that I was talking about before, is a very bright horn. I got it that's changed over the years. I got it back in high school. My trombone teacher at the time said, you need a new horn. And I absolutely did, because I had just a small single trigger horn. He said, if you're serious about this, you need a better horn than this. And he said, I'm going to get one for myself, and I'm going to order you the same thing. And so we decided, okay, we'll do that. And it was a Bach with a 10.5-inch bell, a lightweight slide, a very bright horn. And it was a little too bright in a lot of situations. And over the years, I've done some things to it, had a heavyweight slide put on it and an open wrap and so forth. But the bell is basically the same. And it's very bright. It tends to work very well in jazz and big band stuff and commercial things. I can really pop out and play, down in the pedal register and have it be heard, in a loud big band situation. Now it's a sound that I kind of like, but in orchestral situations, that's probably a little too bright. So several years ago, I got another horn that I use for situations like that. That's a little darker. It's a little more open. It has Thayer valves on it, and it's a different kind of horn. I like it now. It took me a minute to try to figure out how to play it, but now I like it, and I use that for some, other kind of situations. So yeah, you kind of adapt your sound. I mean, your sound is kind of your sound, and that can work in different situations, but that was more of me trying to fine tune what I thought I should try to be more of in certain situations. So
one thing that I've heard from everybody that I've talked to, and something that I've personally experienced when listening to your playing, is that, speaking of sound, is that you have a sensational sound on the instrument.
Oh, well,
so we wanted to ask, I'm not trying to blow smoke. That's something that I've heard from everybody. It's been
Yeah,
like,
we
oh
even
yeah.
have a comment right now saying
Yep.
his live sound is amazing.
We wanted to just ask you, who are some of your favorite bass trombonists for sound?
Oh, geez. I mean, guys like, there's plenty of guys. I love the way they play. I mean, of course, George Roberts and that kind of setting has a great sound,
Mm-hmm.
Dave Taylor has a great sound, there's lots of guys. Doug Provience has a great sound. Over the years, I kind of not so much try to copy other people. I don't know, try to develop a sound. It was easier on this horn that I could try to, especially in a big band setting or large jazz group setting, where I could get a nice edge to the sound, but have a full body. But, the edge really helps to make it cut. If you're playing a big shout chorus and you got a lead trumpet player that's bumping it out, I always feel like I need to be right there and be able to be heard. So that the edge that I think I've been able to develop on my sound contributes to that. I've heard other situations where other people, they're working hard, but it's a darker sound and it doesn't cut as much sometimes. And having that edge just helps to get the sound out there in certain situations and have it be heard. So my concept in big band playing is always, depending on the writing, of course, but if the lead trumpet player is the most important brass instrument, then I always think of the bass trombone is going to be the second most important, so that you have a good lead and a good foundation. Obviously, it depends on the writing. If you're playing, certain, not every writer writes that way. Playing a Sammy Nestico chart or something, and the baritone sax is more oftentimes the bass voice in the brass section, as opposed to somebody like Thad Jones, who will write the bass trombone and kind of in that role. And if you're in that role, I always feel like you got to provide that foundation for the whole band, which means you got to be heard. You got to be that foundation that everything else is built up on.
So you're talking about the Vanguard and Thad Jones big band. Can you talk about how you started working with them and your experience in that band?
Sure. It's great. I've had an association with that band for a long time now, always as a sub. I've never actually been in the band, but I never got a chance to play with Thad. Obviously, he started the band with, obviously, Thad Jones Mel Lewis Orchestra, and then he left the band and moved to Europe, and it became the Mel Lewis Orchestra. And I got a chance to hear that band a lot and got a chance to meet Mel, but unfortunately, I never got a chance to really play with him. After he had passed away, my man Douglas Provience, I probably owe more of my career in New York to him than anybody else. He was the first guy that called me to play Broadway. He played the whole run of Cats when it was here on Broadway, and I subbed for him a lot, did that show a lot. And shortly after he called me for that, he called and said, "You'd be interested in coming down to the Vanguard and playing with the band?" And I said, "Obviously, I'd love to do that." And at the time, he and Earl McIntyre had two bass trombone players in the band. Two bass trombones. So, I started subbing for Doug and then, would play next to Earl, and then I get a chance to sub for Earl too. And so it was great. And that's how I got involved in the band. And it's been great. I've done, played a lot of Monday nights and gone on the road with them. And it's really always a privilege to play with that band. It's a lot of fun.
But I've been to the Vanguard a few times when you were playing in there, and it's so much fun to hear the difference in bass trombone. I know it's not comparable, Doug Provience to you, because it's just different players. So it's not a matter of better or worse, but it's such a unique sound when you're in there. So it's so much fun.
Oh, well, thanks. It's fun to play that book. It's fun to play with Doug too. Sometimes I'll play the third book next to him, and then that's fun too, because as a bass trombone player in New York, although usually when I'm doing that now it's on a large tenor, but you don't get a chance to play with other bass trombone players a lot. So when you do, that's kind of fun. When
I first went to the Vanguard to hear you play, I actually heard you blowing. So I knew you first as a bass trombonist, and I knew that you had improvised, but I had never heard it live before. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired you? Because this record that we played at the beginning was released in 97, where it was, we like to think jazz bass trombone is a very new thing, but you were doing this in 97. What inspired you to do that?
I would always be playing jazz, through high school and college. I wasn't necessarily good at it, but I was trying anyway. And even when I was in college, I played in a small jazz group. I would kind of gravitate more to playing tenor trombone most of the time in those situations. It hadn't really, I wish it had more, occurred to me, why am I not playing bass trombone? And that's what I do. Why am I not playing that more in smaller group settings? It wasn't probably till after I got out of school and came to New York and started playing more in different bands that I started to try to really improvise more on bass trombone. So I had kind of been doing it, just not maybe as much on bass trombone. I joined Lionel Hampton's band a few years out of college, and he liked the way I played, and so he would throw me a lot of solos, when I first got on the band, which was great. I remember talking to one of the sax players in the band once, and he said, because when I did that, I would a lot of times play in the upper register, the horn, more as a tenor trombone player would, and I'd get down into the lower register a little bit, but I was talking to this guy, and he said, when you play down in the lower register horn, that's really what makes the horn and you unique as a soloist. So I started thinking about that and trying to purposely play more in that register. And over time, it just became more natural to just play through the whole register of the horn. I guess at the time, I wasn't hearing a lot in my head down in there. Miles Davis talked about him not playing in the upper register as much because he didn't hear up there. As an improviser, you kind of play what you hear in your head. And so I think at the time I wasn't hearing as much down in that register. And over time it just developed more to play throughout the horn. Especially when I moved to New York, initially there weren't a lot of people that were necessarily playing jazz on bass trombone, improvising a lot. I've faced that and kind of fought that a lot through my career in various big bands. The idea that you're playing with 3 other trombone players who are tenor trombone players, and they obviously all have the ability to improvise, but as a bass trombone player, you probably don't. And it was always struck me, why is that the assumption all the time? And I get why. I mean, there's a lot of great bass trombone players in New York who are great playing in big bands or something, but they just don't improvise. They don't do that. In New York, almost never go to a big band and the guy who's playing second trombone says, oh, I don't really improvise. I just want to play my part. That doesn't really happen. So, and certain people will hear me and play somewhere and think, wow, I didn't know you did that. And I always thought, well, why did you assume that I didn't, So that's always been an assumption, and writers don't necessarily always think to write solos in a bass trombone part, because again, I get it to an extent, and they're thinking, well, if I might put it in front of somebody and they say, well, that's not something I do. I always think it's a color in a big band that I wish more writers would write for, and they have started to do that over the years, and as more bass trombone players have arrived in New York, like the two of you, who have the ability more to do that kind of thing. So now it's become a little more prevalent now. So I always feel like there are great soloists, especially in New York, great guys who I play with. Talk about playing with the Vanguard band or something, and they, there's people like Scott Wenholt and Terrell Stafford and Rich Perry and Dick Oates and Gary Smolin and all these incredible soloists. And I always feel like I never put myself on that level of playing necessarily, but I feel like I kind of have something to say as a soloist. So I enjoy the ability to be able to do that, as there's plenty more bass trombone players coming on the scene all the time that, I feel like I got to get practicing again and make sure I can, still do this in a way that people want to hear me. So
you definitely got something to say. I'll just say that. So don't be worried about that.
I could talk about the group too.
Yeah.
I didn't really touch on that, but
we were just about to ask you.
Oh, okay. That was a little while ago now. It all happened because my good friend Steve Armour, who was an incredible jazz trombone player in New York for many years, he and I met on the Lionel Hampton band, and it was around that time, or maybe shortly after I had left the band, that he was over at my apartment one day and looking through the International Trombone Association journal, and looking through that edition had all the different competitions that they hold every year, and one of them was the Kai Winding Jazz Trombone Ensemble competition. So he was looking at that, and he looked at me and he said, hey, we could win this. He said, we'll call Bruce and Pete, and Bruce Idem and Pete McGinnis, and get some guys together, but we'll write some tunes and get a rhythm section, and we'll send it in. And so that's what we did. We wrote 4 tunes and put a rhythm section together and crammed into a recording studio in Brooklyn and recorded a little demo, and we ended up winning the competition that year. So the International Trombone Festival in Minneapolis, I think it was that year. So that kind of got us off the ground and running, and we wrote some more material for that CD, did that, and we had a little run of doing different gigs and so forth, and now we've kind of life happened and so forth, and we kind of scattered around, but I'm proud of the album. I feel like it came out well, and the four of us, we were all good friends anyway, and had a lot of fun doing it.
Do you have any interest in maybe doing another record or reviving it somehow?
I don't know so much about reviving that group. I do have some ideas about a solo project that have been kicking around for way too long in my head, and hopefully maybe we'll come out of this with some real direction. Well, I say we. Maybe I'll come out of this because it's on me.
Oh, it's we. It's we.
I'll come out of this with some direction on what I would like to do. I really would like to do that and have some ideas, and have mentioned it to some other people. And so hopefully I'll get my act together and make it happen.
I have a question regarding the Dan Pugash nonet. So you think of a bass trombone in a big band, and there's like a specific role, and then there's like the orchestra setting, but in a jazz nonet, it's usually, alto, tenor, bari, trombone, trumpet, maybe a second trumpet, piano, bass, and drums, maybe guitar, but not typically a bass trombone added. Can you talk about the role of the bass trombone in that setting, how it's different or alike to big band or other settings?
Well, it's all up to the writer, really, in a lot of ways. Dan is a great writer. I've gotten a chance to play with that group a bunch over the last, I don't know, 6, 8, 9 months or more. And it's great. It's a really fun size group to play with, because it's a lot smaller than a big band. As I said, he's a phenomenal writer, so he writes some really interesting things. And as a bass trombone player, you get a chance to play. He does have a baritone sax in the band, so as well. So there's times when you play more of that traditional role of being the bass voice in the overall horn section. He has alto, tenor, baritone, sax, trumpet, tenor trombone, and bass trombone is the horn section. So sometimes, he'll write in ways where you're playing down in that role, and other times you're not. You're playing, an inner part, sometimes with other instruments that you might not ordinarily play with directly, as in a big band setting. So it's a lot of fun to play. It's a different kind of challenge, and it's a lot of fun to play in that kind of setting. It's always fun to play in jazz settings like that aren't big bands, because it's and it completely depends on the writing. There's some other groups that I've played with over the years. A trombone player named J.C. Sanford, who used to live in New York for a while and had an interesting group that had a couple strings and various different woodwinds, other than saxophones. And there was the chair that I used to play was bass trombone and tuba. It was a lot of tuba, and it was very interesting to play in that group, because it was definitely a quote unquote jazz group, but it was completely different than playing in a big band. So it's a different thing within the jazz style that was challenging and a lot of fun to play.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between playing bass trombone in a section where it's the trombones playing and you're the bass, versus when you're kind of more lining up with the bari player? That's
what's kind of fun about playing bass trombone in a lot of big bands. The writing can vary quite a lot. You have the more traditional sound of playing with the trombone section, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, supporting the trombone section as the foundation of the section. But you also might be playing with the baritone sax, not with the rest of the trombone section. You might be playing with sometimes that's with the bass player. Sometimes it's just bass trombone and the bass player playing things together. And so I think the challenge is to know your role in a lot of that, and know when you should stand out, when you should be more supportive of other things going on in the music. That's part of the challenge, and what I really enjoy about playing in a lot of big bands. The writing can vary quite a lot. It's fun to play different kinds of music where, playing something by Thad Jones where you're playing that bass voice a lot, playing something by Bob Mintzer where you're maybe doubling the bass a lot, maybe a little more, and, filling that role a little bit. So there's all kinds of various styles where you're playing in different roles and jumping around. And the key is to listen, trust your ears, know what your role should be, and and play that role, whatever it is. And it's constantly changing a lot of times. So it's fun.
You've been someone who's been freelancing in the New York scene for many years. And we wanted to just see if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about how the scene has changed or how it's stayed the same.
Well, when I arrived in New York, I kind of caught the tail end of what was a very vibrant recording scene at the time. It took me a minute to kind of get into it. There were a lot of recordings going on. You know, there were recording studios in Midtown. There's several big studios. That was actually my first job, was working at Clinton Recording Studios, which is no longer around, unfortunately, as a lot of the big recording studios are not. There were a lot of jingle sessions happening all the time. And I remember being in the studio, just working at the studio and seeing all these, you know, heroes of mine, people that I had seen on the back of albums, all kinds of things that, you know, Michael Brecker and Randy Brecker and Jim Pugh and Wayne Andre and Dave Taylor, of course, and Paul Felice and all these people coming in to play a, you know, a Coke commercial or something, or a Lemon Pledge or something, you know, and in addition to all kinds of other things that, you know, that they were doing, real creative projects. The jingle industry has kind of gone a completely different way with synthesizers and sampling and so forth, and home studios, and those big dates of doing jingles, you know, a couple a day or something, you know, for which was a huge industry at one point, has kind of gone away. And there isn't as much, there obviously isn't as much recording work because a lot of the major studios have had to close up. And at the time, Broadway, I think, was not the major industry that it is now in the quote unquote freelance world. I kind of consider that, even though it's a regular job, I sort of think of it as more of a freelance gig, because you never quite know how long those jobs are going to last. And so many people make a majority of their, or at least a good part of their living, playing as subs in that world. Nowadays, that has become a major industry in the New York scene, in the freelance world. I think there's probably as much creative stuff going on as there ever was. It's different in some ways. I think there's all kinds of people just putting their own projects together and having bands that, you know, will get together and play through a bunch of music, find gigs and so forth, and that kind of things. And I think I don't know as much about the, you know, the classical freelance orchestra world, if that has changed a lot over the years. Not really sure about that, but I know at least those couple aspects are, I think, changed since I've been in town anyway.
Well, the industry is changing a lot now when it comes to virtual recording and everything that's going on. Can you talk a little bit about how you think it's going to change for the better or for the worse?
This whole quarantine thing is going to be really interesting to see in a lot of ways, not just music. You know, I've had conversations with people about how it's going to change, you know, may change how companies think about people working at home and so forth. As the technology gets better for musicians, it's obviously easier. You know, I remember joking years ago about, you know, people, oh, wouldn't it be great to do a recording session and all I got to do is, you know, jump out of bed and sit down and play, and I can play with you. And at the time thinking that's preposterous, you know, but now it's exactly what happens, or can happen anyway. Technologically, that's an amazing thing. Whether or not that's really good for the music or for musicians is another thing. I mean, as you know, it's not the same playing in my, you know, in my bedroom over here with playing with you. It's in the same way. It's, you know, it's different talking with you from if you were sitting here, you know, in person talking. So I think as musicians, it's always easier to play with people, physically with them. You know, I don't see playing at home or remotely as ever being a substitute for that necessarily. The energy that you feed off of with other musicians around you, I don't think you can replace that. You can replicate it well sometimes, but it'll be interesting to see how this whole quarantine, the effect that it has long term on things. I hope that people are still, and I think they will, people are still going to want to come out and hear live music, I hope, because, you know, you do that and it's a real experience in a club, in a concert, in a show, you know, whatever it is, opera. You know, I think the interactive experience the audience has with live performers, I think you can't replicate that, you know, online or, you know, with something like that. So I hope that'll come back and be as strong as ever, if not stronger. Maybe people realize that they really miss that more now because of all this. So I hope so. We'll have to see.
We all are. We're all hoping so. One thing that Gina and I have actually been talking about a lot, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about this, is that you're an avid doubler, and Gina and I both played tenor, trombone, and tuba as well. And we've been working on projects, and We've learned that you can, there's a process of, if you're doing a remote recording, you can have one person just play all the parts for something, or you can sort of split it up and say, okay, this one person will play trombone 1, 2, this other person will play 2, this other person will play 3 and 4. I wanted to hear if you had any thoughts about that. Just having everybody one person play everything versus having different people play parts.
It depends what it's for, I guess. Again, that's the experience of playing with people live. I'm going to play differently depending on who I'm playing with. I sometimes will sit in a big band or something and play with a lead trumpet player that maybe I haven't played with a lot recently, and we'll start playing, and I'll think, oh yeah, okay, this person plays a little differently than maybe whoever I was playing with more recently there that I play with a lot, maybe, and so I have to adjust to that. A lot of times playing the upper register, the horn, more as a tenor trombone player would, and I'd get down into the lower register a little bit, or a lead trombone player, whoever I'm playing with in the section, I'm going to adjust based on what I'm hearing that they're doing, and they're probably doing the same thing with me to an extent. When you aren't able to do things collaboratively at the same time, some of that is lost. You sort of go on faith, even if I'm doing things by myself. It's an interesting project to do, but if you lay down a track and then you lay down the next one, and then you get 2 or 3 tracks into that and realize that on the first one you really played this note out of tune, and you're trying to have to, if you're in a section and you're doing that, then you immediately can adjust and fix that based on what you're hearing. But when you're laying down parts individually, that's harder to do. Even if I don't do them all myself, even whoever starts, you kind of have to go with that. Wherever they put the intonation, wherever they put the dynamics, the energy in certain places, you kind of have to go with that, and that can compound in a very bad way sometimes. I've done that before and thinking, wow, this is really out of tune. But at this point, this sax player that laid this down 2 weeks ago, that I have to sound match now, that's not going to change. So I just got to work around it. I think it's always a little better when you can be collaborative in a more live situation, even in a recording studio, because you can adjust immediately and things like that. But it's fun. I mean, I enjoy doing multi-track things. That's a different kind of thing. It's fun. It can be valid in its own way, but it's definitely different.
I have a question. So you're one of the very few bebop bass trombonists. Like, you have a lot of facility in the instrument and with the language and improvising. Can you walk us through your process of how you began improvising and how you learned the language?
I always listened to a lot of jazz, and I think that's key. From an early, like high school age, I listened to a lot of jazz. I used to go, I'm dating myself now, it's very easy now. At the time, there was no YouTube, and that kind of thing. I used to go to this local library, and I realized they had all these records, these great jazz records that you could, just check out and take home. And I used to do that all the time. And I would just go through it and think, oh, I've heard of this person. I don't know, what they do really, how they sound. I'd take the record and go home and listen to it. And I was exposed to all kinds of things in that way. And I often ask people, if I do a clinic or master class at a school now or I'll often ask people, if you are interested in playing this music, this isn't just about jazz, this can be any style of music. If you're interested in playing this, how many people are actively seeking out and listening to, I'll use jazz as an example, but jazz outside of schoolwork and things like that. If you're playing in a big band, you're playing a Nestico chart or whatever, how many people have gone and checked out the Basie band playing this, or a Duke Ellington thing or whatever it is? Because there's no better way to learn how to play in the genre, again, with any style, than to listen to the masters that have recorded things. Go listen to them live, obviously, if you can. Failing that on recordings, and really now with YouTube and so forth, you can find virtually anything online. So there's really no excuse to not do that. So I always listened to jazz a lot and developed a real feel for the music. I think improvisation for a long time was such a foreign concept to me. I had, and I got to a point, even in college, where I felt like I have ideas in my head. I can sing a line, in my head, but I can't always make it come out the horn. It was a real breakthrough for me. And I think it was even after I got out of college, when I got to a point where I could hear a line in my head and know exactly where to play it on the horn. And that was such a huge thing for me, because I kind of learned to play pretty much by ear. and since then I've been on my own, kind of gotten into the ability to record changes and things a little more, but still a lot of what I do tends to be by ear, but that ability to be able to hear things. So I felt like I had the concept of how to play bebop, for instance, and the ideas are I felt like I had in my head. And when I was able to translate that and make that come out the horn, that was a huge thing for me. And as I talked before about it, developed hearing throughout the whole register of the horn, it was easier to develop the facility there and try to think, well, how can I play this bebop line down in the pedal register of the horn? Over time, I've tried to develop that a little more, and it's become just easier to play. That's part of the horn. I don't concentrate on playing the lower register necessarily. Just as you hear a great baritone saxophone player doesn't just play in the lower register of the horn. They're playing all through the horn, because that's what the horn can do. So things that I hear in my head, are just part of the range of the horn, wherever that happens to be. So I'm not sure if that answers the question exactly, but
it does.
So for every instrument, there's like, a list of musicians and players that people should know. Could you talk to us about what the list for bass trombonists, improvising and not so, are?
People like George Roberts, Dave, obviously, who I've gotten to know since being in New York, is, he's done so much as a soloist. I don't think he thinks of, I know he doesn't think of himself as necessarily as a jazz player. It's he's done what I think, all of us try to strive to do, is just develop a completely unique concept of how to play the horn and play as a soloist. There are great bass trombone players in New York that I always sought out to listen to, guys like Doug Provence. It was a guy, that I sought out pretty early, and George Flynn is another guy. I love the way he sounds with Maria's band and so forth. Bill Reichenbach is a guy that is a great, jazz player, a guy that plays, multi-instruments, but plays bass trombone, really, really well. Phil Teal, I used to listen to, on recordings and things. Guys like that. There are obviously great classical players, both, historically listen to recordings of Kleinhammer and people like that. And then even now, Jim Markey, and who's now in Boston, is, he's put out some great albums. And George here in the Philharmonic in town. You hear different people and take different things from them when you listen to them, and try to adapt and take different things that you like about the way they play and try to emulate that a little more. Those are a couple of people that come to mind. I'm sure I've left plenty of people out. One thing I think is important, this doesn't apply so much to bass trombone sound and things like that, but developing more of a jazz vocabulary. I think it's obviously, I was going to say it's obviously obvious. It's obvious that you want to listen to and try to emulate people that play your instrument. Maybe for me, as a bass trombone player who was maybe trying to figure out how to improvise, there wasn't always a good example of someone who does that really well. I mean, I listened to Bill's album that he did years ago, where he played one tune on, I think it was one tune in the album. He played on bass trombone and was improvising on it. And I thought, wow, this is a really cool thing. I haven't seen a lot of people do this, but it's also important. So I would listen to other trombone players and tenor trombone players, obviously listen to people like JJ and Curtis Fuller and Watrous and people like this, and Slide Hampton, who's just had a birthday the other day. But also the point I was going to make was it's important to get away from your instrument and listen to people on other instruments and try to emulate what they do on your instrument. And that can be hard, because sometimes you have to fight idiosyncrasies with your instrument that don't exist. If you're listening to a tenor sax player or something, you're trying to play a Sonny Rollins solo or a Coltrane solo or a Charlie Parker solo or something, and you have to figure out how can I adapt that to play it on trombone or bass trombone, but it gives you a challenge. I'm not going to let the fact that it's a lot harder to move a slide around than it is to press keys on a saxophone. If I'm not going to let that get in my way, then you find ways to play on your horn the things that you're hearing in your head.
Great. This is all amazing information, so thank you for sharing. You covered a lot about what I'm about to ask you, but I wanted to ask it again anyways, in case you had any other thoughts. But for a lot of bass trombonists, they're just starting to dip their toes into jazz, so we wanted to see, and improvising specifically, so we wanted to see if you had any tips or things that you wish you knew when you started improvising, apart from what you just said, which was all amazing.
I think the most important thing you can do is listen to a lot of the style of music that you're trying to play. If you're trying to figure out how to get into improvisation, it can be daunting if you've never done it before, especially as if you haven't studied school or whatever. It was for me. I had back in 8th or 9th grade or something like that. I remember the first time I think I was at a music camp in high school, and I looked over at one of the other guy's parts, and he had these slashes, with word symbols above them. I had no idea what that was. I had never seen it before. And I just thought, what are you supposed to do with this? And it was such a foreign thing for me early on. I had no idea. It seemed such a daunting thing. I think, first of all, you have to jump in and keep the faith and trust that you can figure this out. I think for me, learning to play in a jazz style is important. Learning just the language, the overall feel of how to play that, how to swing, as some people would refer to it maybe. There's no better way to learn that than to listen to a lot of it. You can describe it to people, but I think to really be able to do it well, you have to listen to a lot of that kind of music and hear it in your head what that's supposed to be like. So that's the main thing, I think. And then just try to trust what you hear. Try to not be overwhelmed. You don't have to play these amazing Charlie Parker bebop lines to have it be valid. You can play something very simple, especially when you're starting out. It doesn't have to be complex. It could be very basic. You want to push yourself, but not try to play things that you're not capable of, when you're in public. Of course, when you're by yourself, you want to push yourself as much as you can. So, but just the idea that it doesn't have to be complex. I remember doing a thing with somebody where we play a blues and, okay, this chorus, you're going to play just one note. You can play as many times as you want, but you play one note. Next chorus, you can add a second note to that. Third chorus, you can add a third note to it. Study the fact that you don't have to play these amazing lines. Find a good note, fit it in some cool ways, and that kind of thing. So I get that it can be very daunting. You got to jump in at some point, develop that jazz style, and just try to develop what you can. And listening is always, to me, is more important than anything else, I think.
We have some questions on the live that are fun that we'd love to ask you. You ready?
Okay. I hope they're fun for me.
All right. The first one is, what setup do you play on your contra?
It's an F contra. It's a Dylan make, which is it's a copy of a Tyne, I think. So it's an F. The one valve is geez, what is it now? It's F, D, and B flat. First valve is a D as opposed to a C. It's an independent setup, so the two together is an A flat, I guess it is. So let's gotta figure out the intonation on it. But I know some of the others are in F, but it's almost it's like a bass trombone tuning, but down a fourth. And this one is slightly different. And I've just got used to playing that setup where the first valve is a D rather than a C. I've just gotten used to that, and it seems to work better. What it allows you to do, actually, which it didn't even occur to me at first, is you can play notes, especially down in the lower register, in the same position that you would play it in on bass trombone, but a different valve combination. I don't know if that helps. No, I've sort of gotten it. I mean, whatever, you're playing it horn in a different key, and I think for trombone players, for me anyway, that threw my head. Played all kinds of games with my head for a little while, but once you kind of grasp it, it starts to make sense.
We had one question that was asking, what's your bucket list gig? Even if it's a gig you've already played.
Good. Well, probably my bucket list gig was the one I didn't get to do. My first Broadway show was a show called Sunset Boulevard, which was back in the mid-90s, I guess it was. The opening night party, I think. I got a call. When you're doing a show, for those who don't know, you accept a show. And normally on Broadway shows, there's a lot of flexibility to take off, get a sub. There's a lot of people that make, as I said, a living subbing on for other people on shows. So there's a lot of flexibility for me playing a show to take off, play a concert somewhere else, get somebody to play for me. But when you're first starting the show, there's a lock-in period where you pretty much have to be there all the time for all the early rehearsals and once you get into the show and opening the show and have the critics come and so forth. So I was doing this show, Sunset Boulevard. It was opening night, and I got a call opening night after the show. It was at the opening night party, I think, from Herb Besson, who's a bass trombone player in New York. This was a Thursday, I think. He said, I need somebody Saturday to sub for me with Frank Sinatra. And I thought, great, except that I'm locked into this show for another week. And he said, yeah, I can't do it. And Paul Felice can't do it. And George Flynn can't do it. And so, those are the guys they want me to call, and neither one of them can do it. And so I'm calling you. And I just felt like I'd love to do this, but this is my first show. Maybe now I try to figure out if there's a way to make it happen. But so I had to turn it down, and that was the only time I ever got a chance to play with him, or would have gotten a chance to play with him. So that's the bucket list item that's not going to happen now. So
I can feel it. I can feel it still stings a little bit. I feel bad that we asked.
yeah, a little bit. No, it's the one thing I was hoping, maybe, and he, Frank was getting a little older at that point, and so it wasn't that long after that he retired, and so I never got the chance again. So what are you going to do?
Okay, well, hopefully this next question is going to be more fun.
I've gotten a chance to do many amazing things, so I'm not complaining.
Okay, so we have a question so it says, do you prefer to sit behind the bari sax or on the other side of the band? They know it varies from chart to chart, but what's your overall feeling about this?
In the Vanguard band, for instance, the baritone sax is on the other side of the band than the bass trombone. But the bass trombone is also right next to the bass player, which does not always happen in other bands too. So a lot of times it's very helpful to be right behind the baritone sax player and be able to hear them very well, especially if the writing involves a lot of writing where you're playing with the baritone player. The thing about the Vanguard is you're right in the middle of the band, which is great. The baritone sax is over on the other side, which is not always as ideal for me as a bass trombone player, but being right in the middle of the band, I mean, you're right in front of the drums, you're right next to the bass player, so you really have a good sense of where the pocket is, and especially if you're playing things with the bass player, that's helpful. But I think being closer, obviously, to who you're playing with is always helpful, more helpful.
Every stream we've been asked to do this, and that's just to talk about your thoughts on independent versus dependent. Yeah.
I have always played since I got this horn, which is, later in high school. I've always played an independent valve setup. I understand, people who say that's, not as ideal from a sound standpoint, maybe. I remember going to a master class that Charlie Vernon held once, and he was all over people that played a dependent setup. He said, there's no reason to not play an independent setup. You get 5 feet away from the horn and you can't tell the difference. So he said, why are you doing it? He was actually, starting a little faux attitude to some students that didn't have that still played a dependent horn. Whatever. I'm not subscribing to that necessarily, but for me, I've just gotten used to playing an independent setup. I've gotten used to the advantages, because I think there are some, of playing the second valve by itself more, especially as an improviser. I think I've utilized that aspect of the valve setup too. So for me, I've just gotten used to that. I've always done that. So that's what I prefer. I haven't played a dependent horn since high school. Every bass trombone I've played since then has been independent. So that's my preference.
Can you talk a little bit about first getting introduced to a scene and how you find work in a scene, be it getting into a Broadway show as a sub and then finding your own show, or big bands and stuff like that? It's
important to get out and meet as many people as you can. If it's possible for them to hear you play in some way, obviously that's a big deal. The more people the more people you can go see them play. We've all had gigs that are our own gigs, and people show up and you're just so grateful and happy that, wow, somebody wants to come hear me play, or even if I'm playing with somebody else and somebody comes and hear you play, down to the Vanguard, and you show up, just like, wow, great, Gina came to check out the band. This is a great thing, and that means something to people, and it's a positive experience all the way around. When I go hear somebody else play, it's I'm always thinking in my head, I need to keep doing this, do this more. And as far as being a new person in town, the more you can do that, the more you can make yourself available, be around as much as you can. Obviously, as a young person in town, if somebody calls you, can you make this rehearsal? As a young person, when I was first around in town, yes, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure I can be there for this kind of thing, and be prepared when you show up, and be on time, and be respectful of the people who have been doing this for a long time before you, and most importantly, to try to sound as the best you can, because that gets around. New York is it's a big city, but it's a small community of people, and I think in New York anyway, I have no experience anywhere else other than being in New York, but I think it's a welcoming place, I think, for musicians, at least in the trombone community. I think, people will give you a shot. It's up to you to take advantage of it. But, I think generally people are good about, let's give this person a try for this gig or whatever it is. So the more people you can get to know and hopefully play with, and you want to always be prepared. I learned that early on, I think, when I was in New York. I've told this story a few times to different people. Dave Taylor called me up once. I think it was when I was working at the studio, and he came in and I was going to take a lesson with him or something. And he said, I can't make the lesson, but I need a sub for Charlie Small's trombone octet. Charlie, great trombone player, was in New York for a long time. He had a trombone octet that met every week. And I said, great. I love, I went and played and met a lot of trombone players for the first time, and played with Tommy Mitchell, who was a great bass trombone player in New York at that time. And then, talked to Charlie, and I said, if you need somebody again, I'd love to do it. Felt like I played well. And I said, I also play tenor trombone if you need that. And that's kind of where the story leads is he said, great. And a couple weeks later, he called me to play tenor trombone. And it's like, great, but I hadn't been playing it as much and felt like I wasn't as prepared as well as I could have been. And it was okay, but it wasn't, you always want to sound as good as you can, obviously, as a new person. So I'm glad I did it, but the moral was, if you're going to do this, then you better make sure you're practicing enough on whatever you say you could do. First impressions are important. So you definitely want to go for it. If you get the opportunity to do something, go for it. And just try to be as prepared as you can. Those are some thoughts, I guess.
It's been such a blast having you on. Yeah.
So it's been great. Well, thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun. I'm hope it meant something to some people, and it's really been great.
Yeah, this has been amazing. So for everyone who's on the live stream, remember, if you want to hear more about Mr. Nelson, you can find him on jeffnelsontrb.com for trombone. You can find his bio and your recordings, and you can get in contact with him as well. So be sure to hit there. Be sure to look him up on YouTube to find he has a bunch of videos. Look for his record, New York Trombone Conspiracy. It's very good. Would recommend buying it. Thank you so much for tuning in.